All right, Shabbos, say good morning, good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul, Jerry and Sarah Wolaski, for dedicating all the Sherman Joshos this month in the schus of Refuah Shlema for Zechariah Dov Ben Perel Shira. To thank the Tilson and Wall families of Eretz Yisrael for dedicating all of the Shiurim and Joshos this month in the schus of all of our children who were zocheh to get married, Baruch Hashem, over the course of this summer. Truly, Al Havai, we should all be zocheh Meretz Hashem to celebrate many simchas with our families in the years to come. To thank Shani and Avram Kelman for dedicating all the Shemon Drashos this month in memory of their beloved parents, and then in the schus of all of those who need a refuah shalema. But so with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today. Another fascinating daf. Today's daf is Tes Zayin 16. And we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on the bottom of Tes Vav Amud Beis 15b. We left off actually 2, 4, 6, 7 lines up from the bottom. So first, remember again in yesterday's daf, we had an interesting machlokes between Rabbi Yosef Lili and Rabbi Akiva, namely regarding what happens or the distinction between an Eved, ultimately again who is redeemed by family members, versus an Eved who is redeemed by others. At what point in time does an Eved, when he's redeemed, go free? Versus at what point in time does he become a servant to the people who redeem him? So this is a fundamental machlokes. Now the Gemara introduces a third opinion. Am Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Am Rabbi Yochanan. Zudiv Rabbi Yosef Li Rabbi Akiva. Up until now, we've been focusing on the opinions of Rabbi Yosef Li and Rabbi Akiva. However, Aval Chachamim, the Chacham say Hakol l'Shichrer. The Chacham say any time that you redeem an Eved Ivri. Remember again, when speaking over here, we're talking about an Eved Ivri, a Jewish servant who was sold to a Gentile master. The Chachamim say that any time you are redeeming an Eved Ivri, by definition, he goes free. He goes free. That is true whether his relatives are redeeming him. That is true whether others, achirim, meaning non-relatives, are redeeming him. He goes free. The Gemara says, Man Chachamim, who are the Chachamim? Rebbe is Rebbe. The mapikle lahai be'ela the drush achrina. So first of all, Rabbi Akiva, excuse me, the Chum used the word be'ela ultimately again for a different drasha. Umikra nidrash beina lefanav beina la'acharav. And I'm also getting back to yesterday's daf. The way the Chacham, or the exegetical principle that the Chachamim use, is they darshan the pasuk. Every phrase ultimately modifies the one before it as well as the one after it. Rebbe, hi v'yotza b'shnas hayovel my avidle. What does Rebbe do with the phrase that says that the Eved will go free in the Jubilee year, the Yovel year? He needs it for the following. V'yotza b'shnas hayovel. Ultimately, the Eved will go free in the Yovel year, top of Tes Zayin. They both say, this was the interesting thing that I think was bothering many of us in yesterday's daf. Here the Torah is talking about a Jewish servant sold to a Gentile master. And yet what does the Torah say? When does that Eved go free? When does that Eved go free? In Yovel. Yovel, but in other words, we're talking about a non-Jewish master. So what does Yovel have to do with the non-Jewish master? We're talking about a non-Jew who is living as a member of Jewish society. As such, he's bound by Jewish conventions. For such an individual like that, to what we call tachas yadcha, literally underneath your dominion. Maybe it's by stam and ovid kochavim, stam and non-Jew, who's not living by Jewish conventions, not under your control. Amrit. When the Torah says that if you have a Jew, a Jewish servant, who is under the control of a non-Jewish master, that if he is not redeemed, he goes free at Yovel, obviously we're talking about a non-Jew living in Jewish society under Jewish law. I'll say, just to understand, so remember, this is the way Jewish society functioned for a long time, right? Remember again when we had a monarchy, so it wasn't all Jews living in Eretz Yisrael. You had plenty of non-Jews. So what body of law did those non-Jews operate under? So remember again, obviously a non-Jew is not bound by the 630 mitzvahs, but Lamai says something called the Ger Toshav. I say Ger Toshav is a Gentile who lives in Jewish society, who accepts Shav Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, the 7 Noachide laws, as well as accepts the obligation to live under the dominion of Jewish rulership. So that's the situation that the Gemara is describing here. So we'll say, so bottom line, three-way machlokes about what happens when you have a Jewish servant ultimately going ahead and working for, or I should say, the servant of a non-Jew. So machlokes Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yossi HaGalili, when he is redeemed, does he go free, or ultimately again does he go ahead and work for someone else? So Rabbi Yossi HaGalili, Rabbi Akiva have their machlokes. The Rabbanan hold that halacha l'maisa. The Rabbanan hold that no matter what, he always goes free. Now I will say this is actually an interesting machlokes. How do we paskin? So the Rambam in Hilchos Avodim, Perek Beis, Halacha Vav, writes as follows. So he goes through. So first of all, the Rambam writes over here that if a Jew is sold to a non-Jew, ultimately, again, the first obligation of redemption is upon the Eved himself. Right? The goal is the Eved should try to extricate himself from those circumstances as quickly as possible. If he's unable to do so, the next obligation rests upon his relatives. If he's unable to do so, ultimately, again, acherim, mitzvah al kol adam mi-Yisrael liftoso. There is a mitzvah upon every Jew to redeem a Jew who is in servitude to a Gentile. I will say, if you think about it, by the way, it's an incredible metaphor as well, right? The Jew being sold in servitude to a Gentile is the metaphor for getting yourself into difficult life situations. When you get yourself into a bad spot in life, whose obligation is it to extract you from that bad spot? And the answer is you. Answer is you. Whether you got yourself into it, didn't get yourself into it, when you find yourself in compromised situations in life, the obligation to extricate yourself is on you. If you can't do it, who's obligated to step in? Family. If family can't do it, who's obligated? Klal Yisrael. And that's what happens with a Jew who's sold to an akum. Now the Rambam writes, Bein Shabadu Akrovim, Bein Shabadu Shar Adam, Yatzel Acheros. The Rambam Paskins like the Rabbanon, who the Gemara identifies as Rebbe, that when you redeem an Eved from his Gentile master, halacha l'maisa, he goes free. No matter who is redeeming him, his family, relatives, ultimately, again, he goes free. Good. So that's the Rambam Paskins. Let's go weiter. Ubishtar. Next. So remember again, the Mishnah said that an Eved Ivri is acquired through a shtar. Says the Gemara Minalan. How do you know that you could acquire an Eved Ivri through a shtar? Amar Ula, Amar Kra, the pasuk says, Im acheres yikach lo. Rabbi said, now this pasuk is by Amma Ivriya. So remember again, we spoke about this a little bit, that halacha l'maisa, that when a person purchases a Jewish maidservant, there is a quasi-expectation that when that girl comes of age, the master is going to marry her. And therefore the Torah says that if you marry your Amma Ivriya, right, obviously once you marry her, she's no longer your Amma Ivriya, she's your wife, right? But if you marry your Amma Ivriya, and then you decide to marry another wife, make sure not to mistreat the Amma Ivriya. If you go out and you marry an additional wife to the girl, in addition to your Amma Ivriya, then ultimately do not diminish any of the marital obligations you have towards your first wife. So what do you see from here? The Torah compares an Amma Ivriya wife. But see, understand, when I say Amma Ivriya wife, a wife can never be an Amma Ivriya, and an Amma Ivriya can never be a wife. In other words, you can have an Amma Ivriya, and then once you marry her, she's your wife. She's not an Amma Ivriya. The point over here is the Torah is saying, if you marry someone else, do not mistreat the first wife. So the Gemara says, Hikisha kasav lacheres. The Torah equates the Amma Ivriya wife to a quote-unquote regular wife. How so? Machares makanya b'shtar. Just like a regular woman, you can marry her with a shtar. So Amma Ivriya makanya b'shtar. So to an Amma Ivriya could be acquired with a shtar as well. So here you see that an Eved, that a servant, the Jewish servant, could be acquired with a shtar. Okay, so Hani Chalman the Amar Shtar Amma Ivriya Adon Kosvo. So they will say that's fine according to the opinion that says that when purchasing an Amma Ivriya with a shtar, with a document, who writes that? The master writes it. Elman the Amar, in other words, the one acquiring the Amma Ivriya. Elman Amar Av Kosvo. But according to the opinion that says that no, it's the father. Because we're supposed to remember again, who are you purchasing an Amma Ivriya from? From her father. So ultimately, according to the opinion that says that it is the father who goes ahead and writes the shtar, then I both say, see, here's what's interesting. If you say that it's the Adon who writes the shtar, then the cases are similar. The same way that the master writes the shtar to acquire the Amma Ivriya. So both say that resembles, so to speak, an act of Kiddushin, where it's the husband who writes the shtar, right? The person, so to speak, acquiring rights is the person who writes the shtar. If you say, however, that by Amma Ivriya, it is the father who writes the shtar, then in that case, again, it is not comparable to the case of Kiddushin. So to which the Gemara says, the itmar, shtar Amma Ivriya mikosvo, when purchasing an Amma Ivriya, who writes that document? Rav Huna Amar Adon Kosvo. Rav Huna says, it is the master who goes ahead and writes it. Rav Chisda Amar Av Kosvo. Rav Chisda says, no, it's the father who writes it. So Hanichal Rav Huna. So Rav says, so therefore again, this whole discussion makes sense according to Rav Huna, because then you can say that the shtar Kiddushin is like the shtar Amma Ivriya. Al Rav Chisda Ma'ikle. Remember, according to Rav Chisda, ultimately, again, the shtar Kiddushin is not like the shtar Amma Ivriya, because the shtar Amma Ivriya is written by the father, whereas the shtar Kiddushin ultimately, again, is written by the husband. So we'll say, so again, remember, let's stay focused. We're trying to figure out over here, from where do we know that you could acquire an Eved with a shtar? That's Eved Ivri. Let's try to figure out, how do we know that you could acquire a Jewish servant with a shtar? So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Acha Bar Yaakov Amar Kra, Lo Seitzei Kitzei Sa'avadim. So the Torah says, once again speaking about an Amma, that an Amma does not go free like a regular servant. Like a regular servant. But say, remember again, we're going to speak about this in greater depth. The halacha l'maisa we're going to see, for example, an Eved Kenani, a non-Jewish servant, goes out by Rashi Evarim, right? If you injure him in one of the 24, extremities, so to speak, you cut off his finger, right? You blind his eye. We're talking about even accidentally, right? An Eved Kenani automatically goes free with any of these types of injuries. An Eved Ivri, on the other hand, or an Amma Ivriya, does not. That's what it means when it says, Lo Seitzei Kitseis Ha'avadim. She does not go out like a non-Jewish servant. She does not achieve emancipation like a non-Jewish servant. Aval, Niknis Hi Kikin Avadim. But she is acquired, even though she is not emancipated, ultimately again, like Gentile servants. Halacha l'maisa, she can be acquired like Gentile servants. How so? Umaynihu. What does that mean? Shtar. Document. Just like you could acquire a non-Jewish servant with a shtar, so too you could acquire an Amma Ivriya with a shtar as well. So the Gemara says, that's the source for shtar. Ay ve'ima aval niknis hi kikinin avadim umaynihu chazaka. Maybe not. Maybe it's referring to chazaka, to a proprietary act, and the same way that you could acquire an Eved with a chazaka. I want to say, right, some act demonstrative of ownership, so too you could acquire an Amma Ivriya with chazaka as well. Amakra, bisnachaltem osam lemnechem acharechem. I will say, remember again, herein lies the fundamental distinction between an Eved Kenani and an Eved Ivri. We'll say an Eved Kenani, interestingly enough, is passed down to one's children. So if I own an Eved Kenani, I own a Gentile servant, when I die, so ultimately that's property. That's property, and the property is passed down to my children. That stands in contradistinction to a Jewish servant who is not property. Who's not property, and therefore, what happens if the master dies? What happens if the master dies? The Eved goes free. The Eved goes free. So the Gemara says, so the fact that an Eved Kenani is property, that's why you could acquire an Eved Kenani with chazaka. But an Eved Ivri, or in this case an Amma Ivriya, who is not property, cannot be acquired with chazaka. Osam bechazaka v'lo acher bechazaka. Ve'ema osam b'shtar v'lo acher b'shtar. So maybe you should say that only an Eved Kenani can be acquired with shtar, but no one else can be acquired with shtar. So haksiv Lo seitze kitzei savadim. The pasuk says she does not go out like a Gentile servant, which we infer from that means she doesn't go out like them, but she can be acquired like them. So just like an Eved Kenani could be acquired with a shtar, so to an Amo Ivriya, and by extension Eved Ivri, could be acquired with a shtar. Umarois, how do you know about what to include, what to exclude? Mistabr shtar havelei l'rabuye. We'll say it makes sense to include shtar amongst the mechanisms which can be used to acquire an eved. Why? So the Gemara says, Shekain motzia b'bas Yisrael. We'll say because we see that a shtar works in other contexts. For example, a shtar affects divorce. Shtar affects divorce. Adrabah, because it's just the opposite. Chazaka havelei l'rebuye. We should go ahead and include the case of chazaka. Why? Shekain kone v'nichse hager. Because we'll say shtar works in other situations. For example, nichse hager. Now we'll say nichse hager is an interesting situation. In general, when a person dies, there's always an inheritor, right? Because every single person has a relative. We'll say there's only one case of a person who dies potentially with no relatives. Who is that person? A ger. Right, because remember again, if a person converts, you could have a situation where they don't have any quote-unquote Jewish relatives. As such, when they die, their property becomes hefker, ownerless. And as such, anyone who takes possession of it ultimately owns it. So the Gemara says, Be'ishus miha lo ashkechan. Okay, but I'll say, but you don't find chazaka ultimately working in a marital context. So because you don't find chazaka working in a marital context, that's why I can't be referring to chazaka. Fine. By assuming the other possibility is lahachi ahani imachares. What ultimately again do we need the pasuk of imachares ikachlo? Rav Huna, so the Gemara says, Rav Huna hai lo teitze kitzei savadim my darishbei. What does Rav Huna do with the phrase "lo seitze kitzei savadim"? That she doesn't go out ultimately again like a typical servant. What does he do with that? Chomibayle she'ina yotza berashe ivarim ke'eved. So I will say he uses that again pashat pshat that an Amma Ivriya does not go out berashe ivarim. I will say take a quick look at Rashi. See Rashi lo seitze kitzei savadim. It's actually all the way on top, the last wide line in Rashi. Lo seitze kitzei savadim, Rashi writes, b'shein v'ayin barashe ivarim ke'eved Kenani. So let's remember again, an eved Kenani, if you go ahead and you knock out his eye, you blind his eye, right? Or you knock out his tooth, or you accidentally or intentionally cut off any of the extremities, right? So we'll say, what's the halacha? He goes free. He goes free. That's right, he goes free. Interestingly enough, that doesn't apply to an Eved Ivri. Doesn't apply to an Eved Ivri. So the Gemara says, so ultimately again, Rav Huna will go ahead and use Lo Seitze Kitzei Savadim. Says Kitzei Savadim means that ultimately on a simple level, whereas an Eved Kenani goes out by Rashi Ivarim, if he loses any of the limbs, ultimately again an Eved Ivri does not. Rav Chisda will say, Imkein, lichtov kra, lo seitze ka'avodim. If that's the case, let the pasuk just say, she does not go out like avodim. My kitzei sa'avodim. Ultimately, again, what does it mean, kitzei sa'avodim? What does that mean? Going out like the avodim, shma min tarti. So we'll say, comes to teach us two things. Number one, that an Eved Ivri ultimately, again, does not go out for Rashi Ivarim with the loss of any limbs. And number two, that ultimately, again, although the Eved Ivri does not leave servitude like a Gentile servant, the Eved Ivri can enter servitude like the Gentile servant. Meaning what? The same way the Gentile servant enters with a shtar, so to an Eved Ivri enters with shtar as well. So we'll say, so here we have the source ultimately again of halacha l'maisa of shtar. Good. So now we've conclusively proven that an Eved Ivri can enter servitude with a shtar. I will say, I'll just show you something very beautiful. The Shem Yishmuel, the Sakar Chavareva, so he brings down something interesting. Why is it, from a hashkafic perspective, why is it that an Eved Kenani goes free if he loses any limb, right, or any part of the body, but yet an Eved Ivri does not? Right? It's an interesting. And now again, the simple pshat is it's a pasuk. It's a pasuk, right? The Torah says so. But on a deeper level, why that distinction? I will say, so listen to how beautiful this is. He says, Hatam Mahuso shel Eved Kenani hu achomer, ukishenifkam echa mirashe varav, Nifkam mahuso lachein yosi lecherus. He says, by an Eved Kinani, the entire essence of an Eved Kinani is a physical being. And therefore, again, when you damage the physicality of that Eved, by definition, he's allowed to go free. He's allowed to go free. He says, on the flip side, Masha'inkin Eved Ivri, Hamahuso Hua Nefesh. The essence of an Eved Ivri Rabosai is not his physicality. Even in Eved Ivri, the essence of who he is his neshama. Ukishenifkam gufo ein mahuso nifgemes. If you injure his body, ultimately, again, his essence remains undamaged. Ki hanefesh hu ruchani, va'ruchani ein mischalek l'mein ein nifkam. So we'll say it's such a fascinating distinction. The Eved Kinani is considered to be something or someone who is totally physical. And therefore, if you damage him physically, intentionally, unintentionally, there's a penalty. There's a penalty because you've damaged the essence of the person. By the Eved Ivri, his essence is not his physicality. As much as he's an Eved, right? His essence is not defined by his work. His essence is not defined by his physical strength. Even as an Eved Ivri, his essence is still his neshama. As such, even if you damage him physically, ultimately, again, his essence remains intact, and therefore he's not emancipated. I will say just a fundamental distinction in terms of a person could be viewed in one of two ways. A person could be viewed as a physical entity, or a person could be viewed as a spiritual entity. It's almost as if these two states of being are called Eved Kinani and Eved Ivri. As an Eved Kinani, I'm a person who's totally defined by physicality. As an Eved Ivri, I'm a person who's at least, if not totally, more fully defined by my spirituality than my physicality. Such an interesting idea. I will say, I'll just point out on a halachic level, just to be clear, if you injure an Eved Ivri, even though he does not go free, so to speak, but remember, you're chayiv to him in damages. Right, just to be clear, right? In other words, because remember, an Eved Ivri is still a full-fledged Jew. So you go ahead and you damage him. Okay, he's not emancipated, but Lamaisa, you have a whole host of damages that you have to pay him. Okay, incredible. Let's go back there. So v'kones asal b'shanim. So remember again, an Eved Ivri works for 6 years. After 6 years, he's emancipated. He acquires himself, so to speak, 3 years. So the Gemara says, "Dichsiv sheish shanim yavod ubeshvius." Fine. Uba Yovel, because the Torah says exclusively he'll work for 6 years and then he's emancipated. How else does he acquire himself? By Yovel. Once the Yovel year comes, he also acquires himself. Dichsiv ad shnas hayovel ya'avod imach. Pasuk says he works until Yovel. So we'll say that's talking about the nirtza, the Eved who's pierced. He stays on. He works until Yovel. Giron Kasef. So we'll say Giron Kasef means literally again a diminution of money. So remember again, the way Eved Ivri works, Amma Ivriya works, is remember you're purchasing the Eved, the Amma for a certain amount of money. If the Eved or the Amma want to redeem themselves, so I will say what's the halacha? What's the halacha? We look at the purchase price, divide it by number of years to work, then subtract off number of years worked, and that's the redemption price. I will say this is very important. In other words, when the Eved or the Amma want to redeem themselves from servitude, or for that matter, someone else wants to redeem them, we don't look at the contemporary servant market, but rather, again, there is a fixed amount of redemption. Ultimately, again, redeem her. Melamed shemigra pinyon aviyotza. So we learn from here that halacha l'maisa, she, the Amaviyah, has the ability to buy herself out of the remainder of her servitude. So the Gemara says, V'yotze Tana, the Konas Asma, she could acquire herself, Bekasef, Ubeshava Kasef, through money, through item of value, Ubeshtar, and with document. So we'll say, so there are 3 ways that ultimately, again, an Amaviyah could go ahead and we'll say, remember, whatever applies to an Amaviyah is going to apply to an Eved Ivri as well. There are 3 ways in which she could gain her emancipation. Kasef, buy her way out with money. Shava Kesef, provide an item of value to buy her way out. And Shtar, a document of emancipation. So Bishlam Kesef, Dichsev, Mikesef, Miknaso. So I understand that Kesef, money could be used to acquire her redemption. Why? So it's Mikesef, Miknaso. Shava Kesef Nami, an item an item of value as well. That makes sense. Why? Yoshiv Geula So. Amar Rachmana, L'Rabos Shave Kesef Kikesef. The phrase Yashiv Geula, so you will give his redemption, that comes to include that it doesn't just have to be cash with which you could acquire redemption, but rather even something worth cash. Ela Hai Shtar Hechidami. I will say, what's the case of Shtar? What's the case of Shtar? So Ilema the Kasavli Shtara Adame. So if we're talking about a case where what? Where the Adon writes, or Shtar, I should say, Shtar for the value of the Eved is written. For example, I will say, let's say the Amo Ivriya says, okay, there's $1,000 left on my contract. I hereby write to you a Shtar, an IOU, right? So go ahead, I owe you $1,000, I'll pay later on. So Hainu Kesef, that's the same case of Kesef. Elo Shichrer. So rather, I will say it has to be that the case of Shtar is a Shtar Shichrer, where the owner, the master, is writing a document of emancipation. I will say, but Shtar Lamali, why do I need a document of emancipation? Lemale ba'ape trey. Just let the master say in front of two people, Zeal, go. Or they'll say, why do you need a document of emancipation? Just let the master say in front of two witnesses, you are free. You're free. Or let him say in front of a Beis Din, Zil, you're free. Why do you need a document? So Amarava Zos Omeris, this teaches us, Eved Ivri, Gufo Kanui. This teaches us that an Eved Ivri, ultimately, again, his body is acquired by the master. V'harav shemacho al girono ein girono machol. And therefore, again, a master who is mochel, who forgives, ultimately, again, his remaining claim, the claim is not forgiven. I will say, this is very interesting. If you remember, again, up until now, we just did this a few minutes ago, one of the fundamental distinctions between Eved Kanani and Eved Ivri is what? An Eved Kanani is a possession, is property. He's like karka. He's like land. And therefore, again, even if the master dies, so ultimately what happens to an Eved Kanani? What happens to an Eved Kanani when his master dies? Passed on to the next generation. We've been contrasting that with an Eved Ivri. That an Eved Ivri essentially is like an employee. An employee, he works for you. You don't own him. Vaharaya, the proof to that is, what happens if you own an Eved Ivri and you die? What happens to your Eved Ivri? He goes free. He's emancipated. With that being said, I will say, there is some level of lien against the body of the Eved, right? When you acquire an Eved Ivri, there is some lien. It's not ownership. You don't own his person. You don't own his person, as opposed ultimately to an Eved Kanani, where you do own the person. But an Eved Ivri, you don't own the person, but you have what we'll call some level of shibud haguf, of just claim or lien, literally again against his body. I will say, because he works for you. In other words, essentially what you could do, what you could really say is, you own his labor, but you don't own his body. So I will say, that's a heightened claim. In other words, when someone works for you, I will say, right, you have a business, you have an employee. What do you own of your employee? What do you own? Nothing. You don't own anything of your employee, right? You might have an entitlement to services, but you own nothing. When you have an Eved Ivri, I will say, there is a quasi level of ownership. What do you own? What do you own? You own his labor. You own his labor. And that creates what the Gemara calls a quasi-claim against his guf. Right? Quasi-claim against his guf. Now, why is this important? Because I will say, because you have a heightened level of ownership in an Eved Ivri, simply saying, all is forgiven, you are free, is not enough. When you have that heightened level of ownership, in order to divest yourself of that ownership, you need something more significant and concrete. So this is actually very interesting. So if you want to emancipate your Eved Ivri, what the Gemara is saying you're free. You're free is not enough. Even if you say it in front of two witnesses, even if you say it in front of a Beis Din, it's not enough. It's fascinating. Because there is a heightened level of ownership, there has to either be money that exchanges hands, i.e. the Eved redeems himself, right? Or shtar. Or shtar. I mean, it's not true. In other words, at the end of 6 years, the Torah says you no longer have heightened ownership. By Yovel, the Torah says you no longer have heightened ownership. But Lamaisa, right? If it's not one of those, then either you need kesef, you need money, or you need the shtar. I'll give you a good example of this. We've seen this before, by the way. Let's say, remember the case we had a little while ago? remember which sector it was. Must have been in Gid. Remember we had this case where Reuven and Shimon are partners, right? And Reuven decides he no longer wants to be Shimon's partner. So what does Reuven say? I'm done. I'm done. We'll say, what's the halacha in a case like that? What's the case? It doesn't work, right? It doesn't work. Why? Because when you are vested in something, I will say, in order to divest yourself of that, you need something more formal. Just saying, I'm done, I'm out, right? That doesn't work. So we'll say, so in a partnership, in other words, there is a way to divest yourself of the partnership interest, that it's going to be something more involved and more formal. So too, when you own an Eved Ivri, we'll say, there is a heightened level of ownership in the labor of that person. So just saying, you're free, we're done, that doesn't work. There has to be kesef, or there has to be shtar. Incredible. Ari says, go weiter. So the Gemara says, Yiseira alav ama ivriya. So let's remember again, ama ivriya has even another form of emancipation, in that ama ivriya goes out once she displays signs of physical maturation. Reish Lakish, ama ivriya kones atzav misa sa'av. Now, Reish Lakish says something amazing. Comes along Reish Lakish, and Reish Lakish says, an ama ivriya acquires herself when her father dies. I will say, so just to illustrate this, remember, how do you get into a case of ama ivriya? How do you get into a case of ama ivriya? Father sells his daughter as an amma. That's the only case of amma ivriya. So I will say, now when could a father do this? Obviously, this is either when she's a ketana or nara, right? But ultimately, again, really has to be a ketana, right? Because once she becomes a nara and displays signs of narus, ultimately, again, she goes free. So now Reish Lakish says something amazing. Reish Lakish says, the father therefore sold her as an amma ivriya. If the father dies, she's automatically emancipated. Incredible. So where do we know this from? So the Gemara says, so Mikal v'chomer, Uma simanin shemot simer shos av. Now normally again we'll say simanin, developing signs of physical maturation do not remove a girl from her father's domain. Mosim shos adon. Yet in servitude, again in ama ivriya, once she displays signs of physical maturation, she goes free. So then Rabbi say again based on that, Misa shemotzim shosav, death of the father, which definitely removes her from the domain of the father. And as we'll say, when the father dies, let's say again there are brothers, there are sons, those sons do not inherit any rights in their sister. Once a father dies, that girl is fully independent and autonomous. So I will say, if death removes her from the domain of her father, she definitely removes her from the domain of her master. So I will say, see here, Kal v'chomer. Kal v'chomer is like this: simanim, which do not remove her from the reshus of her father, remove her from the reshus of her master. Therefore, death of the father, which does remove her from the reshus of the father, should certainly remove her from the reshus of the adon as well. Okay, interesting. So Meisiv is the kasha. So Meisiv Rav Hoshia, Yisera of Amoivriya. Amoivriya has a certain element above and beyond Eved Ivri. Why? Shekones atzma b'simanin. She acquires herself with simanin. Isa, if you're correct, Reish Lakish, Nisni Nami Misa Sav, also including that death of the father. That's also, in other words, remember, that would be an additional way that Amma Ivriya acquires herself, that an Eved Ivri doesn't have. An Amma Ivriya acquires herself with the death of her father, but yet an Eved Ivri does not. To which the Gemara says, Tana Bashir, you're right, the Tana didn't include a full list of mechanisms for emancipation. So my shir, what else did it leave off? So the Gemara says, my shir, the high shir misa sa'adon. It left off the death of the master. For example, again, death of the master is also a mechanism of emancipation. The Gemara says, if that's the case, that's not really something you left off. Why? Because remember again, since the death of the master works for both an Eved and an Amma, it didn't include it in this list. Velanisni said, why not go ahead and include this? Reish Lakish, if you are correct that the death of the father allows for emancipation of the Amma Ivriya, why not include that in the list of mechanisms of emancipation for an Amma Ivriya? Tana davar sheyesh lo kitzba. So, sorry, Tana davar sheyesh lo kitzba katani, davar she'en lo kitzba lo katani. I will say, ultimately, again, the Tana only included things which by definition are defined. defined. So, for example, I will say simanim are defined, right? A girl is going to display signs of physical maturation. Death of the father may or may not occur. So he only included items that are definite and are going to occur. So the Gemara says, "V'ha simanim de'ilan kitzba." But 1 second, I will say so. Simanim don't have a defined or specific time. In other words, I will say what that means is you don't know when a girl is going to display signs of physical maturation. Rav Safra, ein lahem kitzba lemala, aval yesh lahen kitzba lemata. I will say Amud Beis. Interestingly enough, simanim, I will say, they don't have a ceiling. In other words, anytime after a girl reaches 13 years, which is really 12 years old in one day, anytime after that, if she displays signs of physical maturation, those are halachically significant. But Rabbi says we're going to see there is a kitzbah, there is a shear, an amount, or I should say, a definition for how young she could be. Rabbi says we're going to see physical signs of maturation are only meaningful after she's reached a certain age. Before that age, they are considered to be insignificant. The Gemara will say, let's see it. Taz 16b, Desanya. Top first line, 16b, Desanya, because we learned in the Brisa, Ben Teisha Shanem Shehevi Shtei Saros. If you have a girl who is 9 years old, and she sprouted 2 hairs. What's what I was talking about? 2 hairs in the pubic area. So I'll say, so what's the halacha? Shuma. I will say we do not assume that those are signs of physical maturation. Rather, we attribute it to a mole. A mole. In other words, it's hair for different reasons, but it's not signs of physical maturation. Mi ben tes shalim yom echad. But from the age of 9 years old in one day, ad ben yud beis shalim yom echad, but up through 12 years old in one day, va'odan bo, and the hair is still there. Shuma. Those are attributed to a mole. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Simon. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Simon. Rabbi says, no. If the hair remains there through the age of 12 years old in one day, at that point in time, we assume it's a sign of physical maturation. Ben Yud Gimel Shanav Yom Echad. But at the age of 13 years old in one day, Divrei Akol Simon. Everyone agrees that Allah Chalamaysa, this is a sign of physical maturation. So I'll say, so the point over here is with simanim, as much as there's no ceiling. In other words, that from whatever age above 13 years old, she goes out and develops these simanim. They are significant. There is a limitation in that if she sprouts them when she's very young, we don't look at that as signs of physical maturation. So Maser Rav Sheshes, Rabbi Shimon says, Dalid ma'anikim lahem. So we'll say, so remember again, right now our whole sugya is focused on this statement of Reish Lakish, right? What does Reish Lakish say? Reish Lakish says that Allah Chalamaysa, an Amma Ivriya, so you have a girl who was sold into servitude. Remember again, how was she sold in as an Amma Ivriya? Who sold her? Her father. Reish Lakish says if her father dies, she goes free. That is another mechanism of emancipation for an Amma Ivriya. So this is what we're discussing and challenging now. Okay, so Gemara says, Masiv Rav Sheshes, so Sheshes raised the kasha. Rav Shimon says, Dalid ma'anikim lahem. There are 4 people who receive Hanaka. Now let's remember again, what's Hanaka? We spoke about this yesterday's daf already. Hanaka is upon emancipation, a master is obligated to give his servant, to give his eved or his amma, ultimately again, gifts. Hanaka gifts, we'll discuss it in greater depth. Gimel be'ish v'gimel be'isha. Ultimately, again, there are 3 cases that apply to a man and 3 cases that apply to a woman. But no 4 cases, no 4 categories apply to either one. Because they're both saying, remember again, there are certain mechanisms of emancipation that apply to a woman that don't apply to a man. For example, simanim, signs of physical maturation. That is a mechanism of emancipation for a woman, but does not apply to a man. And conversely, ve'in ritzia be'isha, piercing of the ear. So I'll say you only pierce an eved, you don't pierce an amma. So there are 4 categories, so to speak, of emancipation that warrant hanaka, but no 4 categories, the full four categories apply to neither a man nor a woman, because there's a fourth that is gender specific, right? There's a fourth, i.e. again, simanim, which only applies to a woman, ritzia, which only applies to a man. Okay, so v'im isa. Now once again, Reish Lakish, if you're right, nisni nami misas av. Reish Lakish, according to you, there should be another mechanism of emancipation that should allow for anaka, namely what? Death of the father. That if you have an Amma Ivriya and her father dies, she goes free, and upon emancipation, what should happen? She should receive Hanukah, these gifts. The fact that it's not included in this list indicates to us what? That obviously it's wrong. Obviously it's not true. I may be also over here, you're right, this list was not meant to be exhaustive. In other words, we'll say the Tana included certain things and excluded others. That's not what the Brisa said. The Brisa did say there are four mechanisms of emancipation, which ultimately result in Hanukah. Right? So Halacha L'maaseh sounds like it's an all-inclusive list. V'chi tema tana davar sheish lo kitzba katani, the davar she'en lo kitzba lo katani. Maybe we'll say this. We said before. Maybe the Tana is only including items kitzba that have a defined measure. I will say defined measure means they're definitely going to happen. Right? They have definition to them. But items that don't have definition, for example, the death of the father, which may or may not occur, perhaps the Tana does not include. I have a simanim deilan kitzva v'katani. So most of the asking the question, what about simanim? Right? Simanim, a girl could develop signs of physical different times. It doesn't necessarily have that level of definition. No, we can't, it's like we said before, but Rav Safra is what we said before, that you're right. Simanim maybe don't have a kitzba lamala. In other words, at any age that she develops them, they're significant, but they do have a floor. In other words, for example, anything below the age of 9 or 12, depending on the particular opinion, will be insignificant. What about death of the master? Death of the master, we'll say, is an item that doesn't have definition to it, doesn't have a defined time, the katani, and yet it's included in this list. Misas ha'adon nami lo katani. You're right, take out death of the master from this list as well. Ve'ela arba'a mainihu. If that's the case, what are the four mechanisms of emancipation that allow for Hanukah? Shanim, years, in other words, after 6 years. Yovel, we'll say Stama Yovel year, right? In other words, we'll say, remember again, the Yovel case is, we saw this yesterday, let's say you buy an Eved 3 years before Yovel. When does he go free? Yovel. So there's a Stam 6 years, that's the usual minimum of servitude, but then the exception to that will be if Yovel comes. Yovel shel Ritzia. Then I will say there's the Yovel after piercing. So that's an Eved who served his time, wanted to stay on, get his ears pierced, and then he remains until Yovel. The Amma Ivriya b'simanin. And I will say for a woman, for a girl, Amma Ivriya, she goes out ultimately again with signs of physical maturation. Those will be the four categories of emancipation which ultimately warrant Hanukah. So I will say, this would seem to be clear. Diktani Seifa, look at the end of that brisa. You cannot apply all four categories to either an Evet or an Amma. Why? Because signs of physical maturation are not a mechanism of emancipation for an Evet. And ultimately, again, piercing doesn't apply to a woman. And I will say, now again, but if it was true that we were including ultimately these other cases, then you should have even 4 cases that apply to a woman. Shmami or not. Good. So we'll say, okay, fine. So we're still with Reish Lakish. Still keeping on task over here, picking up a lot of interesting information along the way, but we're still we're still trying to contemplate this position of Reish Lakish. That Reish Lakish holds that by an Amma Ivriya, if her father dies, ultimately again she will go free. I ask the Gemara again, Masiv Rav Amram, so Rav Amram is the Kasha, Ve'elu ma'anikin lohem. These are the people ultimately again who receive Ha'anaka. Who are they? Hayotze b'shanim u'b'yovel u'b'misas ha'adam. Anyone about say goes free. Shanim, remember again, what's shanim? 6 years. Yovel is Yovel year. Misas ha'adam, death of the master. And by Amma Ivriya, she has a 4th, b'simanim. Right, ultimately again, signs of physical maturation. V'm'isa Reish Lakish, if you're right, that death of the father allows for emancipation of the Amo Ivriya, Nisni Nami Amisas Av, why don't you include in this also death of the father? Reish Lakish, if you're correct, then why isn't your example included? So we'll say once again, we're having a lot of the same conversation here. Maybe the Tana included certain things, and ultimately again left certain things off the list. Elu katani. Rabbi said the lashon of the Braisa is elu manikim. These are the cases. Let's see, which sounds like the Braisa is creating an exhaustive list. Maybe you'll say only something that has definition to it is included. Something that's not fully defined is ultimately not included. So we'll say once again, V'ha-simanim. What about simanim? They learn kitzva, because we'll say once again, simanim, you don't know when they're going to occur, and yet it's still included. V'katani, v'chitema ha'chinami kid Rav Safra. Okay, we'll answer up like Rav Safra. You're right. There's no kitzva ultimately lemalo. In other words, whatever age she gets simanim, fine, but there is a kitzva lemata. In other words, there is a basic age that she has to pass in order for the simanim to be significant. To which the Gemara says, ha'ika misas adon. There's also the case of the death of the master. Tiyufta de Reish Lakish tiyufta. I will say essentially what you see from here is the fact that Reish Lakish's example of death of the father is not included in any of these lists indicates that what? No one accepts it. So I will say, so where we are holding right now in this sugya is you have Reish Lakish who says that halacha l'maisa, death of the father ultimately results in emancipation of the Am Ivriya. What we keep seeing over and over and over, I will say, is all of these lists which talk about what emancipates an Eved or an Amma, right? Or what emancipates an Amma. And really the way that manifests itself is we have these lists that say, when does an Eved receive ha'anaka? When does an Amma, right? When does an Amma receive these gifts upon emancipation? Which is another way of saying, what causes emancipation? List after list after list. What's not included in any of the lists? Or we'll say, what's not included in any of the lists? Death of the father. Which then leads us to one logical conclusion, which is, Reish Lakish, you're wrong. And death of the father does not create emancipation. The Gemara says, but one second, what about the fact? V'harish Lakish kal v'chomer amar. Let's say Reish Lakish had a kal v'chomer. Remember again, what was his kal v'chomer? His kal v'chomer was that if simanim, which do not remove a girl from her father's domain, do remove her from the adon, then death of the father, which does remove her from her father's domain, should certainly what? Remove her from the domain of the adon. What about that kal v'chomer? To which the Gemara says, Amar kal v'chomer prichahi. It's not a good kal v'chomer. There's a problem with kal v'chomer also. What's the problem with kal v'chomer? Mishum dikal mifrach, because you can ask on the kal v'chomer, malas simanim shenishtana haguf. Simanim are different. Why are simanim different? Because with simanim, the actual body of the girl has changed. Tomar b'bisa sa'av shekein lo nishtana haguf. With the death of the father, the body of the girl has not changed. In other words, you're comparing apples and oranges. Simanim mamish represent a literal physical change in the Amma Ivriya. Death of the father doesn't represent any level of physical change. Fine. I will say, bottom line, halacha l'maisa, we reject the view of Reish Lakish, and therefore death of the father does not result in emancipation of the Amma Ivriya. Good. Tani Chada, one Braisa says, Anak Eved Ivri Liatzmo. So it was an interesting question, an interesting discussion over here. Who gets Hanaka? Right? So again, Eved is emancipated, and again, so we'll say, now, here's what we do know. What are the forms of emancipation? Again, here's what we have. Death of the master, Shanim, 6 years, Yovel year, and for Amma Ivriya, we have also what? Simanim. So now when you're emancipated, the Adon is obligated to give you these gifts, what we call Hanaka. Who gets the Hanaka? Who gets to keep it? So Anak Eved Ivri Liatzmo, when Eved Ivri gets the Hanaka, it's his. Ve'enak Amma Ivriya Liatzmo, and the Hanaka of an Amma Ivriya belongs to her. The Tanya Idach, another Braisa says, Anak Amma Ivriya Mitzias Alavia. No, Hanaka of an Amma Ivriya, as well as anything she finds, goes to her father. Ve'ein l'rabba elaschar batala bilvad. So I will say, interestingly enough, so I will say here we have two conflicting Braisas. Braisa number one says that Hanaka goes to the Eved himself or to the Amma herself. Brisa number 2 says, Hanaka, you're right, goes to the Eved, but for an Amma Ivriya, the Hanaka goes to her father. Goes to her father. Not only that, Rabbi was saying, if an Amma Ivriya finds something, a Mitzia, who does that go to? It goes to her father. So what does the master get? The master gets what we call schar batala. Schar batala means that Lamaisa, at the time that the Amma Ivriya was finding or receiving the lost object, she could have been working. There's, so to speak, lost labor for the Adon. He gets compensated for lost labor, but the father gets to keep, ultimately, again, the lost object. Quite fascinating. So my love, hadinafka b'simanim, hadinafka la b'misasav. So we'll say, are we not talking about a case of one is where she's going out with simanim, and one is with the death of the father? Lo idi v'idi dinafka la b'simanim. Both are a case, ultimately, again, which is being emancipated because of simanim. V'lo kasha, hadi isei la'av, hadi lesei la'av. Ultimately, again, one is talking about a case where the father is alive. The father is not alive. If the father is alive, he gets the hanaga. If the father is not alive, she keeps the hanaga. So we'll stop over here for today. We're going to pick up with this interesting sugya tomorrow. We'll say about, again, upon emancipation, who gets to keep the hanaga? Shkoyach. All right, Zoom, have a great day, everyone.